I want to thank you so much, and I want to reproach a movement that claims to believe in fairness and justice. It is absolutely unjust to have to appear before or after the Reverend Barber. And it was very kind of the organizers to put me before, because that's a little easier than appearing after. And I was thinking about it. If I did the best possible job right here, I would still have a problem. And what it brought to mind was a great line from Adlai Stevenson when he introduced John F. Kennedy. And Stevenson said, "Do you remember that in classical times, when Cicero had finished speaking, people said, 'How well he spoke.' But when Demosthenes had finished, they said, 'Let us march.'" And so I'm not going to be Cicero to begin with, but I am already at a disadvantage to a man who has led so many to march on behalf of justice. And I've thought a lot about the Moral Mondays movement and the extraordinary achievements of that movement. But it occurred to me that we have Moral Mondays, but so often in government we have immoral Tuesdays, immoral Wednesdays, immoral Thursdays, and immoral Fridays. So you still have a lot of work to do, Reverend, but I'm glad you have sacralized at least one day, and you might sort of eventually get them to sacralize all those days. There are a lot of friends I have here. I just want to thank two colleagues in particular, and then mention a third, my Georgetown colleague, Mike Kazin, who has, and Joe McCartan's there too, so another colleague, but also Mike Kazin, whose sort of story of America, and I'm going to talk a bit about that, whose way of telling our national story, I think inspires a lot of us to seek justice. Also, my friend Harold Meyerson. Where are you, Harold? Yes, my colleague at the Washington Post and a friend for so many years. And lastly, I can't resist, because I saw her when I came in here. I would like to, many of you know her in this movement. I would like you to give a round of applause to the movement's newest PhD, Elaine Wyndham, who's a friend to so many of us. And in a lot of cases, PhDs always reflect a lot of work, but sometimes they just confirm what we already know, which is somebody's really, really smart and gifted, and that's true of Elaine. Because there is a man of the cloth here, I thought I would begin with 3 readings, though I'm not reading from Scripture. There's a lot of great Scripture we could go with, including St. Paul. We are all part of one another, which is part of what this is about, and Mike is always useful. What does the Lord ask but to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly in our God, although walking humbly is not easy in politics these days. But I have chosen 1 semi-religious reading and 2 secular readings. There is a part of our Constitution that our friends in the Tea Party never seem to mention. And it is actually my favorite part of the Constitution of the United States. This is an educated crowd, so you all know. What is the first word of the Constitution of the United States?
We.
Yeah, let's say it again.
We.
Yeah, I love to have people recite that word. This is a we day. This is what this day is about. And so let me just read the preamble. "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare." Yes, welfare is right there in the first paragraph of the Constitution of the United States, and we should not forget it. "And to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." Now, I think there is a terrible problem in all our public discussions of constitutionalism. First of all, most of these discussions act as if the founders had the answer to every question, and we know they got a few things wrong. This Constitution of ours permitted slavery, and it took a long time for us to correct that. We fixed the Constitution at a number of points in our history, both with the Civil War amendments about slavery and equal protection, and then with the progressive era amendments that included women's suffrage and the establishment of the income tax and the popular election of the United States Senate. But the worst thing about this sort of a misplaced reverence, it's not a reverence for what the founders actually did, because they were, in their time, quite radical. The idea of self-government, the idea of a democratic republic was very radical in their day. And so I think they'd be the last people to say that we should see the Constitution as a set of chains designed to keep us moving forward. And they would always also remind us that they did write this preamble, which told us what we ought to be trying to do together. The second reading is somewhat more religious. We all remember that Ronald Reagan liked to refer to the United States as a shining city on a hill. And that is a wonderful line, and I believe that. But people forget where that came from. The original reference to us as a city on a hill came from John Winthrop, and it was his address to the New England settlers entitled A Model of Christian Charity. And here is perhaps my favorite line in that wonderful sermon. He said, "We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our community as members of the same body." This is back in the 1600s. You think he was about to endorse, say, Bernie Sanders. He also offered a classic and counterintuitive account of how our differences bind us as a community. God created differences, Winthrop argued, so that every man might have need of others, and from hence they might be all knit more nearly together in the bonds of brotherly affection. I wish I could hear what Rush Limbaugh would do with John Winthrop, that great Puritan. And the third quotation, I just can't resist because of the nature of this crowd. I would love you to guess who said this. Today in America, unions have a secure place in our industrial life. Well, that gives it away. It's a long time ago. Only a handful of reactionaries harbor the ugly thought of breaking unions and depriving working men and women of the right to join the union of their choice. I have no use for those, regardless of their political party, who hold some vain and foolish dream of spinning the clock back to days when organized labor was huddled almost as a hapless mass. Only a fool would try to deprive working men and women of the right to join the union of their choice. This was not Gene Debs or Norman Thomas or Harry Truman or FDR. This was Dwight David Eisenhower. And so I think Ike actually had a lot to say on a lot of things and was, if you will, a kind of conservative we can believe in. But I just wanted to, couldn't resist sharing Ike with you. I just want to make a few points today. I want to talk about the interaction that you've been discussing here between civil society, as we often call it, those private groups that were on that map, and the public sector and what we do in common through government. And I think one of the problems in our politics is that we have utterly separated in our minds and in our analyses the link between what we do in common through government and what we do in common through our private organizations. That would include unions, it includes churches, it includes charitable groups, it includes community organizers. We've tried to draw this very sharp line. And I agree with my conservative friends when they speak very warmly of all the institutions of civil society. As some of you know, I'm a Catholic, and I admire the church, that the work that religious organizations, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and Muslim, have done both to secure, both to be charitable and to secure justice. But what we forget is that throughout our history, we have understood that many times those organizations could not take up the entire task of charity, and charity itself is not sufficient because what we ought to seek is justice. And many of these groups dedicated themselves not simply to charity, but also to justice. Mike Conjal, a wonderful scholar at the Roosevelt Institute, wrote a piece for Democracy, the other great quarterly magazine, by the way, along with Dissent. I'm involved with Democracy, and I love Dissent. He wrote a piece in Democracy where he quoted Harry Truman in a 1946 radio address kicking off the Community Chest campaign, which is kind of a predecessor to the United Way. And this is Truman. He said, "I like the campaign slogan this year, everybody gives, everybody benefits. It marks a significant change in our thinking about the word charity. Today, our contributions to the community chest are not alms given by the wealthy few to the poor. The government, through its public welfare program, has long since accepted its responsibility to see that no citizen face hunger, unemployment, or a destitute old age. The word charity has regained its old true meaning, that of goodwill toward one's fellow man, of brotherhood, of mutual help, of love." Yes, Harry Truman, that crusty president of ours, spoke about love. And I am always struck when there are those folks, again, among my conservative friends, who say, well, let us replace some of these fundamental functions of government with private charity. And first, I always tell them that, you know, the most significant insight, I think, of theological insight of conservatives is a belief in fallen human nature, in the flaws of we human beings. Reinhold Niebuhr once said that the only empirically verifiable doctrine of the Christian church is original sin. And I think he had a point on that. And yet, somehow, human beings are very flawed, except at that moment when it comes to charity. And then what we hear is that only if government gets out of the way, then we will all suddenly become very generous and take care not only of the neighbor down the street, which we might well do, but people across town whom we've never met, people across the country whom we will never know. And the establishment of government assistance, I think, was a response to our bad conscience, that we understood that we had this obligation to our brothers and sisters that we would not live up to in our private charity. And Mike, in his piece, lists a whole series of reasons why we must link the public and the private. That charity can be, a private charity is insufficient, that there is what has been called philanthropic particularism. Basically, you help the causes you know and the people you know more than you help the people you don't know. There's nothing particularly wrong with that. Charity is charity and charity is good, but it is wrong for the people whom you leave out. There's also the critique of philanthropic paternalism. And I think that what we have to understand in thinking about the public and private is that public efforts to alleviate poverty and suffering and create a greater sense of justice doesn't kill private charity, as Mike wrote. It allows it to fully thrive. It enables private charity to respond with targeted and nimble aid for individuals and communities, rather than shouldering the huge, cumbersome burden of alleviating the income insecurities of a modern age. Public social insurance state gives every individual, if we did it right, and we have a long way to go, gives every individual the security necessary to take risks, which enriches both our economy and our society. So that's one way in which I think we need to think more clearly about the relationship between the public and the private. The second on this notion that public action displaces private action, the scholar Theda Skocpol has written some wonderful things about this. And what Theda has shown is, contrary to a whole line of critique that if government steps in, it enervates all of these civil society institutions, she showed that how there was an interactive effect between, for example, organizations going back to the Civil War veterans, between strengthening the public and strengthening civil society institutions. We certainly saw that in the labor movement. We've seen that in private charity. It's intriguing, by the way, if the President Bush talked a lot about faith-based charity, and there's some things he said about it I actually agreed with, but if you look at President Obama, he actually ended up providing more help to faith-based organizations than President Bush's administration did. Now, why is that? Well, because there was more effort to help charitable organizations and promote social justice than there was earlier. So again, this split that we see is mistaken. Third point I want to make has to do with a sense of government sort of somehow automatically taking away our liberty by acting. Mitt Romney, when he declared his candidacy for president, and I don't mean to pick on Romney, I actually wish Romney had run more as Mitt Romney when he ran for president, because this, after all, is the man who worked with Ted Kennedy to provide health insurance for all the people in my home state of Massachusetts, which did provide the model for what we now call Obamacare. I wish he had sort of owned up to that a little more. But I'm picking on him because he said something in that announcement speech that really bothered me and I think should bother all of us. He talked about how government now consumed 40% of our GDP, and I can't find the quote in my notes here, but he said basically we were right on the edge of losing our freedom. Now, what he was saying is somehow, if the share of government of our GDP magically crossed to 50.1%, then suddenly we'd be unfree. And so the question I'd like to ask the assembled group is, imagine two societies. Imagine a society that spends very little through government on social welfare, on student loans, on Social Security, on health care for our citizens, on helping our young children. Imagine very small percentage of GDP on that. Most of the stuff government spends money on is a police force, a secret service, not of our kind, but of the kind that spies on people, and a large military. Imagine that society has no freedom of speech, no freedom of assembly, no freedom of religion, no freedom to oppose the government. So that's on the one side, really low percentage of GDP going to government with all those other problems. Then imagine a society, and you might have in the back of your head some of the Scandinavian countries that actually spends quite a lot of money to make sure that people can go to college, to make sure that kids are well cared for, to help people support their families, and then also allows for free speech, for freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, allows people to oppose that government. I ask you, which of those two is the freer society? Not to mention, which place would you like to live in? The one that has a really low percentage that goes into the public sector but represses your rights, or the one that has a fairly robust public sector but protects your rights? Obviously, it is, in a sense, a rhetorical question, and yet it's not a rhetorical question, because when we hear over and over again that the share of our society that goes to government is the biggest deal, that we are missing, I think, what is most important about how we become free. And by the way, we also lose the idea that in a free society, a government can be a powerful enabler of personal freedom and opportunity. In our history, throughout our history, and one of Mike Kazin's heroes, William Jennings Bryan, talked about this a lot. Individuals can be oppressed by private interests as well as the state. Individuals can be oppressed by concentrated private power. And in our history, at our best, we have seen public action as countervailing power. And yes, there are times when we must fight the state. There are times when we have had to fight repressive governments that force segregation on us, that did try to undercut our free speech. But there are times when government is the ally of the people against concentrated public power, and we can't forget that. Two other things I want to say. Again, the role of the public in defending the private sphere. We forget, those of us who think of ourselves as liberal or progressive, how often we have required public action to save our society. It was public action that over and over again has saved the private economy from falling apart. We saw it in the Great Depression, and we saw it just recently after the Great Recession. It was public action that assisted in creating greater upward mobility, which we so desperately need again now through everything from the Civil Rights Acts to the GI Bill to student loans. Again, this was government as empowering of private action. It was public action that protected our environment. And yes, it was public action that took a stand against slavery. We don't defend the public sphere enough in our society. This is sponsored by the Shaker Institute. And I just want to say that I think there's a special obligation on the part of public sector unions. And obviously, the public sector unions always defend the public sector because that's where they work. But I think that they also have an obligation no other sets of unions have. They have to be friends of reform of the public sector. Yes, they have to defend their members' interests, but if they do not also seek to improve the quality of the public sphere, then their members, their values, and ultimately the public sector itself will suffer. And I think one of the conversations we need to have is how our public sector union movement can become a friend of reform. 2 points I want to make in closing before you are moved to action by the Reverend Barber. The first is how many ways have voluntary people doing voluntary action, people engaged in voluntary action, created great movements of reform. I am fascinated by the people in the progressive era who went into those settlement houses. And a lot of them were do-gooders. And by the way, I've just recently developed an aversion to anybody using the word do-gooders, because I really want to ask, what's wrong with do-gooders? Do you prefer do-badders? Do you really want, I feel like asking anyone who condemns do-gooders to have to write me a 500-word essay on why do-badders are better than do-gooders. I'd just like to see what they had to say. These were do-gooders who went into the slums, worked with immigrants, and what happened? They did a lot of work one-on-one. They did a lot of work trying to help people hold their families together. Sometimes they tried to convert my Catholic forebears into Protestants, but we'll leave that aside for today's discussion. And what they discovered is one-on-one help is great, but it was not enough to solve the problems that they confronted. And so what did they do? A lot of these do-gooders who did the one-on-one work became part of a series of great social movements. They became part of the progressive movement. They became part of the socialist movement. They became part of the union movement. I have always liked on the whole issue of faith-based connection to the public sector. The historians of the room will remember the last words of Teddy Roosevelt's speech when he accepted the nomination of third-party progressives. He said, "We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." And I've been waiting for somebody to say those words at a Democratic National Convention for quite some time now. And so I also think we need to look kindly, and kindly doesn't begin to say it, we need to look find ways of strengthening the impulse that we see among so many people in the millennial generation to serve others. I'm very soft on the millennial generation because contrary to all this stuff that says they're selfish and they're self-centered, actually the data shows quite the opposite. These are folks who really do care about others, who do have a sense of the public good, who are more tolerant and open than their elders are, and that's partly because they are the most diverse generation in our nation's history. And so I think we should want to build up all of the organizations supported by the Corporation for National Service, because once you get involved in trying to solve a social problem, it is one of the happiest addictions that we can imagine, that people, once they get involved, very rarely go away. And then they move toward political action. And I think that is where we also have a lot of work to do, especially those of us who teach in public policy schools. Right now, there is far more confidence among young people in the efficacy of private nonprofit organizations than there is in government. And I think that means we need to reform the ways in which government hires. We need to make it a lot easier for young people to go to work for the government. We need to give them a sense of the excitement of that work, to give them independence, a sense that you can be entrepreneurial in the public sector as well as the private sector. One of my favorite stories from Carolyn Kennedy Schlossberg is that she said that one of the most moving things that's happened to her all her life are people coming up to her and talking about her father and saying, I went into the public sector, I did public sector work because your father asked me to serve. Now, it wasn't that he asked people one on one. He, like FDR back in the 30s, created an ethos that self-government is a very exciting proposition, and that being part of that process is a very exciting proposition. And so alongside all his other evangelization, I hope the Reverend will encourage more young people to go and do this work. So I want to close, as I often like to close talks of this sort, with one of my very favorite quotations about politics. And it comes from the philosopher Michael Sandel. And Mike Sandel said that when politics goes well, we can know a good in common that we cannot know alone. We can know a good in common that we cannot know alone. Those of us who believe in the public sphere, private and public and in cooperation with each other, know there are goods we can have in common that we cannot have alone. We have to stand up for that. We have to fight for that. And we have to remember with John Winthrop that as a society, we are better off when we identify with each other, feel for each other, and if I can link Bruce Springsteen to the Puritans, if we remember, I love linking Springsteen to Puritans, remember the line in his song, wherever this flag is flown, we take care of our own. We got to start taking care of our own right now. Thank you all very, very much.